Hola, soy Nicky Mouse, señora Pau Esponja, tiempo, tarjeta de 1, 200. Vamos, no, aquí. Antes de eso. Oh,
2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day
Oh.
4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually,
Bueno.
12 o'clock midnight.
¿Cuántos?
1 hour later, 2 hours later.
2 horas después, una mañana que caigo.
3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20
Wow.
minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later, later that same
What?
evening,
Yep.
several days
Se me está
later,
yendo.
6 months later,
6
2 hours
Just
later,
later.
4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later,
Hey,
1
man.
debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8
Why?
hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3
Hours.
hours later, epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much, much, much later, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59
Ahora.
a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later,
Hey,
a
man.
little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later,
Ahora.
years later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much, much later.
Oh, much
Yesterday,
later.
many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day. Meanwhile, later, just then, what follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the
Later.
void. Approximately 10
Bueno,
hours
sí,
later,
man.
early the next morning,
1 thing I don't.
shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math
Hey,
later,
man.
24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later,
Hours.
72 hours later, 2 hours later, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, flashback, and a flashback, the very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days
What?
later, the next morning, moments later, more moments later.
Ahora día mañana ya cuento. Si no se lo ni más.
1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later, 80,000 impressions
Wow,
later.
esponja.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Wow.
3,000 whoos later, soon after, later, moments later, the next morning, many unbearable hours later, 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later. Many secret parties later.
Wow.
Moments later. One nap later. One very long digestive tract later. 6
Yes.
months later. One pathetic sob story
Later.
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 Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. One shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next morning.
What the
Later
shit?
that night. The next day. One weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
Wow.
5,000 celebrities later. Meanwhile, 5 little boost to the surface later. A few minutes
Hey.
later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later. The next morning. Later that night.
Oh shit.
Next evening, one operation later, 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning later, 1 hour later, 7 months later,
Sí, me va
next
later.
Christmas,
Pues,
several
la
long
vida.
days later, many toys later, 12 sleepless hours later, one beautiful Christmas morning later.
Otro.
The next
Alto.
morning. The next morning.
There's money.
Frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 1 day later. 1 humongous meal later. 1 entree later.
Later.
4 o'clock
Con
in the
la palme.
afternoon. Several bouquets later.
¡Uh!
10 hours later.
Ahora sí, ya mañana está sonando como esponja, pantalones cuadrados. I need it. Tío. There's later. Ah, later. Eso sí.